You know, every time I go to speak somewhere, someone will come up to me and say, I'm guessing you're tired of hearing this. And then they'll share a story about influencing my father. Let me tell you something. I'm not tired of hearing it. Every time, Dad, I just think how blessed I am and thankful and just how proud I am of you. And Dr. Piper, thanks for being a part of that, doing the Josh McDowell Institute, just continuing to carry on that tradition. I'm honored to be a small part of it. Well, those of you who have been here this weekend, we've been talking a lot about apologetics. You saw a scroll this morning, how we know it's true. You heard arguments for the existence of God yesterday from Dr. Turek. The question, though, is how do we take this truth and pass it on to the generation coming behind us? That's a question that I'm guessing all of us, to greater and lesser degrees, have asked ourselves and wrestled with. So I got a question for you. As you think about the next generation of those coming behind you, maybe your kids, maybe your grandkids, maybe it's just the young people in the church, what do you think your role is to them? In other words, if you're going to write a mission statement of your responsibility to the generation coming behind you, what would it say? I teach at Biola University now, and for 10 years I taught full-time high school Bible classes. And I would ask my students a lot of questions just to kind of get a sense of what they were thinking. This is a Christian school in Southern California. And I'd ask my students over and over again, I'd say, more than anything else, what do your parents want for you? And what do you think the number one response I got is? My parents just want me to be happy or to be successful. Now, I'm guessing this is true for you, but I want my kids to be happy, and I want my kids to be successful. But is the purpose of parenting and grandparenting and looking at the next generation to raise up a generation of people who are happy? I would much rather have my kids be miserable and following the Lord than happy and walk away. I had a student come in and talk to me, just a great kid, junior in high school. Last he told me he wanted to be a Bible teacher. And he comes in, it was during lunch break, and he was really flustered. He goes, Mr. McDowell, can we talk? I got a problem. I said, no, it's my lunch break. Come back later. No, I didn't say that. I'm just kidding. I said, of course, step into my office, which is a desk in the middle of my classroom. I said, what's wrong? He goes, man, last night I had a talk with my dad, and I don't know what to do. I said, well, what was the talk about? He said, my dad sat me down and he said, son, I will pay your way through college and your way all the way through medical school. I said, what's the problem? That's a pretty good deal. He said, I don't want to be a doctor. I think my dad thinks it looks good for him if I'm a doctor. And second, my dad looks at me as his future nest egg. Now, I know this father loves his son because he sends him to a Christian school, right? He cares about him. But I have to think this guy has an idea in his mind about the next generation, and it shapes the way he raises him. Well, when I look in the Bible, I see a very different perspective in terms of how we should think about young people. Psalms 127:4 says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. In other words, we are to look at the young people in our church, in our community, in our families, as future warriors for the kingdom of God. Now, that's a very different perspective of young people, the greatest resource God has given us, than we typically think when we look at students. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's exactly what we're going to look at this afternoon. I'm going to draw your attention to a passage in the book of Deuteronomy. If you can't find it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Deuteronomy. Now, in Deuteronomy, you know the context. We'll turn to the particular passage in a minute. Deuteronomy was written by Moses at the end of his life. So here Moses has spent 40 years wandering with the people in the desert, being a prophet for them, shepherding them, fighting for them. And now he cannot go into the promised land because of disobedience. So he writes this book, Deuteronomy, to give final words of wisdom so the people can move into the land and they can be successful. So notice the change that these people are going through. They no longer will have a pillar of fire by night or a cloud by day to tell them exactly where to go and to see God's presence with them. Instead, they're moving into a land and they're going to eat and drink from crops and vineyards they didn't plant. They're going to live in buildings they didn't construct. In other words, they're moving into foreign territory, into a city based upon principles that are different from biblical principles. Does that sound kind of familiar to where we are today? In fact, I don't even think we live in a post-Christian culture. I think we officially live in an anti-Christian culture. And what Moses taught to these people are exactly the same principles I think we can apply to passing on the faith. So he starts off in Deuteronomy chapter 6. If you can't find it, it's right after chapter 5. Now, by the way, before we look at it, Deuteronomy chapter 6, this passage we're going to look at is called the Shema. And it's actually considered by many people to be the central passage of the entire Old Testament. So Orthodox Jews will still repeat this passage twice a day. In fact, Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law? What does he do? He cites the Shema and then answers their question. So this passage in Deuteronomy 6 is very central to the heartbeat of the gospel. It starts off in verse 1. It says, "This is the command, the statutes and ordinances the Lord your God has instructed me to teach you." Very quickly, we're just reminded, and you and I know that all Scripture is inspired, but occasionally the writers remind us that they're not the source and it comes from God. So Moses stands between these 2 to 3 million people and he says, look, I'm not making this up. This isn't my wisdom. This is God speaking through me. And then he starts off, and then he says in verse 2, "Do this so you may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, by keeping all his statutes and commands I'm giving you, your son, and your son's son, your grandson, so you may have a long life." That's always been fascinating to me. That here Moses is speaking to people. He gives them commands to follow, but it's not really for them, is it? He said, this is so you're faithful for you, for your son, for your son's son, and all the generations that'll follow afterwards. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think of my life in terms of the X number of years that God gives me, and then I think I'm gone. Well, I know I'll be gone, but that's the perspective in which I think about. But Moses has a very different perspective, doesn't he? He's saying, think about these principles and obey them, because your choices will affect your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids, and every generation afterwards will be affected by our faithfulness or our lack of faithfulness. That's a very different perspective and gravity to the life that we live, isn't it? In fact, I think about this in the life of my father. I know many of you know his story well. Growing up in a small town in Michigan with a father who was the town drunk, who my dad almost never knew sober until my dad was in his 20s. His older sister committed suicide. His older brother sued their family just out of spite for his father. As my dad has been courageous enough to share, when he was younger, between 7 and 13, he was sexually molested for 7 years until he slammed the guy up against the wall and said, "If you touch me again, I will kill you." I heard these stories growing up and always knew my dad had it bad. But I remember maybe a couple years ago, we were sitting around as a family, and my mom was telling funny stories of growing up in Boston. And my sister Heather, who's 10 years younger than I am, she was laughing, and we were having a good time, and she says, "Hey, Dad, tell a funny story you remember when you were a kid." Awkward silence. I'll never forget Dad. He looks at us kids and he says, "Kids, I don't have one." And for some reason, my heart just broke in a way it had never broken for the life that my dad had to live growing up. But you know what? And you know the story. My dad's spoken to more young people alive than anybody on the face of the planet. He's written 100 and some books. He's had an unbelievable influence. And you know what? By all sociological standards, he should be in jail or the head of a gang or be dead. But God got a hold of his life and just transformed him. You know what I think my dad's greatest legacy is? This Josh McDowell Institute is fantastic, and I hope it lives for many, many years. But I think my dad would say his greatest legacy is the fact that his son and his 3 daughters love the Lord. That his 8 grandkids love the Lord. You see what Moses is talking about? He's saying when we start to think about our lives and our faithfulness in it, it's going to echo for generations to come. And then Moses continues. In verse 4 it says, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is one. I think right away we learn a principle about passing on the faith to the next generation. It's this: make God the Lord of your home. Make God the Lord of your life, and make God the Lord of your home. Because something is Lord of your home. Something is. Could be money, could be fame, could be success, could be a hobby. Something is Lord of your home. This here came clear to me a couple years ago. I'm guessing you guys have had the same experience that I've had, where you sent a text message or you hit a Facebook message, and the moment you hit send, you wish you could reach into cyberspace and have it back. I was on a plane not too long ago, and I looked ahead as we landed, and we're pulling our bags down. I see one of my good friends about 10 or 15 aisles in front of me. So I thought, you know what? Instead of yelling his name, because it starts with a B like bomb, and that could get me in trouble on a plane, I'll text him and make sure he stays afterwards and we can hang out. So I texted him. I said, hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you. And I sent it to my mom. Who was home alone reading at night. Now, fortunately, my mom has a good sense of humor. She texted me back. She said, hey, son, I think you've got the wrong punk. Note to self, don't call your mom a punk, right? Well, I tell you that because about three and a half years ago, I had my first public debate on university campus. It was this high school professor in my town, but he had his doctorate, he had a PhD. And he was sued in a court of law because he said disparaging statements against Christianity. It made its way all the way up to the O'Reilly factor. Kid recorded him under the desk. You might remember this story. And then sued him. Well, we debated publicly at a university. And it's online. If you like to watch this stuff, we debated God and morality. You can watch it, make up your own mind. But I prepped a long time for it. And I remember a few weeks beforehand, I got an email from a girl. And she said, hey, I'm the school newspaper, editor. Can I interview you for the upcoming debate? I said, of course. Come on over to my classroom. And then a couple days later, I got another email from her. And I'm reading this email, and halfway through, I'm thinking, oh my goodness. She was talking about depression, rebellion, anger, loneliness. And then it dawned on me, I thought, oh, she didn't mean to send this to me. She accidentally copied me on it. Well, she came to do the interview for the debate. She was about to leave. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to bring this up. Maybe in some divine sense, she was supposed to send this to me. I said, you copied me on an email. I realized it probably wasn't for me, but I read it before I knew that. I'm not a counselor, but it looks like you're dealing with some heavy stuff. What's going on? You know what she said? She said, you're right. Depression, anger, loneliness. I'm in rebellion against my parents. She said, in fact, I was raised as a Christian, but I've left my faith. She said, in fact, I was just in church last Sunday or 2 Sundays ago. She said, but I've walked away from my faith. My parents don't even know. I said, well, why? What's at the heart of it? She said, the bottom line is I have a hard time believing in a loving, caring Heavenly Father when my dad has been such a workaholic and he's been so distant. You know what she said? She said her dad would work all the time. He was never there for him. Even on Sundays, driving to church, come home, he'd work all Sunday night. And she said, I have a hard time believing in a loving, caring God of my Heavenly Father when my dad has been so distant. You see what Moses is talking about? He's saying, make God the Lord of our home and make God the Lord of our lives. Every single one of us in here, something is Lord of our lives. You know what I think the best way to figure it out is look at how you spend your money, pull out your checkbook. If you have a checkbook, the modern digital equivalent, or pull out your calendar. Because Jesus said where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You know what I think kids really clue into what matters most to mom and dad? I think it's when something goes bad. When things go south, it's like kids are watching, antennas go in, and they're thinking, does my mom and dad, does my pastor, do my papa and Grammy, do they really believe this? So I'll never forget, years ago, I was driving probably 6 or 8 hours up north on this freeway called the 99 in Central California to speak at a Christian camp. And I drove up there with a pastor. I'd never met him before. I don't remember almost anything we talked about for 8 hours, but I'll never forget one thing that happened. We're driving up, and we're on this road where it looks like desert, like we'd be in, well, certain parts of Oklahoma. And, sorry, I couldn't resist. We have those parts in California, too. We're in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden I hear this loud, screechy noise coming from the car. My first thought was, man, why did we drive this car? Thinking, gosh, we're going to be late. God, can you bail us out? After all, I'm going to speak for you. Like, all the wrong things are going through my mind, and I'm getting frustrated. Pastor pulls over, and he turns to me, he says, let's pray. I see problems as opportunities to trust God. I sat there and thought, compared to this guy, I am a spiritual raisin. But you know what that communicated? He really believes it. And God is really Lord of his life. So the first thing Moses asks us when we look at the next generation is to look inside and say, who or what is Lord of our life, and who or what is Lord of our home? But then he says in verse 5, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. In other words, love God with what? This is the participatory part of the program. Love God with everything. Love God with everything. Why is it important that we love God? Because I'm convinced that kids will tend to follow the passions of their parents. In other words, what you get excited about, what your voice, lucky I'm wearing my Batman shoes. What your voice raises in the sense of getting enthusiastic about, your kids will tend to get enthusiastic and passionate about. So I was taking my son to school when he was in first grade. He was 6 years old. His name's Scotty. And I'm driving in there. I said, Scotty, what do you love? He said, well, Daddy, in football, I love the Chargers. I said, okay, well, what else do you love? He said, in basketball, I love the Lakers. I said, well, what else do you love? He said, in baseball, I love the Red Sox, and I hate the Yankees. Now, the strange thing that he gave 3 sports answers is in my family, we hate sports. Yeah, you don't believe that, do you? Why did my son say in football, I love the Chargers? Because my wife's dad, my father-in-law, taught high school football for years. And Sunday, their tradition was watch the Chargers and get excited about it. So we watched the Chargers. Why did my son say he loved basketball? I actually played 4 years of basketball at Biola University, and I know what you're thinking. But you're short and you're white. Which proves only one thing. There must be a God. My wife was actually a college point guard as well. I just love the game of basketball. I just had a chance to speak to the team here briefly before leaving. I love basketball. Why did my son say he loves the Red Sox? Because my mom, his Grammy, grew up for a while in Boston, and she loves the Red Sox. And yes, she hates the Yankees. In fact, when the Red Sox aren't even playing, she's checking the scores just to make sure the Yankees lose. She's still excited they won the World Series this year. Now, here's the interesting thing. You think I had to sit my son down and say, Scotty, you're McDowell. That means you love the Lakers. Scotty, you're McDowell. That means you love the Chargers. And Scotty, you are a McDowell. That means you love the Red Sox and you hate the Yankees. Did I have to tell my son that? Of course not. Instead, he just observed his mom and dad getting excited about things and cared about certain things and valuing certain things. And he started to identify himself that, and it became important to him. This is why Moses says, love God with everything. Because what moves us to just get excited about, our kids will tend to get passionate about. What moves us to tears will tend to move our young kids or our grandkids to tears. But then he goes on. In verse 6, he says, these words I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. These are to be in your heart. I get a chance to interact with a lot of skeptics and with a lot of atheists. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm taking a group of 25 high school students to Berkeley. And we're bringing in some atheists and skeptics, and we're bringing in a homosexual activist to speak to our students. I'm going to teach my students how to treat them lovingly, how to ask good questions. But I get to interact with a lot of non-believers, and I enjoy it. And I ask them this question all the time. I'll say, tell me your story. How'd you become an atheist? And one thing I hear over and over again, in fact, I just had a buddy I was meeting with in the Northwest, and he said, gosh, I grew up in church. It was about all these rules we had to follow, these things we couldn't do. It was never something that was in my heart. In fact, this is similar to what happened to one of the great artists of all time, Vincent van Gogh. You know, Vincent van Gogh grew up wanting to be a pastor. He wanted to be a pastor, but he couldn't master Greek, so he couldn't become a pastor. Instead, he became a missionary. And from all the records we have of the life of Vincent van Gogh, you can read about his life. He wrote letters. He was a very successful missionary. He was seeing people come to Christ. He was ministering to people. But he kind of lived like an ascetic lifestyle in the sense if people were sleeping outside by the mines, he'd go sleep with the people. He'd give them the shoes off his feet. And he'd just minister to people where they were at. But he came before the mission board to have his license renewed. And they shot him down for 2 reasons. They said, 1, Vincent, you're not a good enough preacher. They said, 2, your appearance is unbecoming of a minister of God. Obviously, they hadn't read the story of John the Baptist. So for 6 months in his life, he falls into a sort of depression where he stops writing letters. And then letters show up, and he talks about wanting to become an artist. Do you know Vincent van Gogh died thinking he was a failure, having sold 1 painting to a relative for almost nothing? His paintings now go for millions. You know how much I had to pay for them? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not Van Gogh. But Vincent van Gogh, although he was burned by the church, the secular story is that he walked away from his faith and became an atheist. I don't think that's true. I think we may see Vincent van Gogh, even though he definitely had some mental problems, in heaven. But he used his art to critique the church. So A Starry Night, arguably one of the most famous paintings in the world, as you look at this painting, your eyes are probably drawn to the sky, right? It's moving, it's vibrant, it's active, it's alive, because Vincent believes Psalms 19:1 and 2. The skies proclaim the glory of God. The heavens declare his majesty. Day by day they spew forth speech. Night by night they display knowledge. Vincent believed the natural world revealed God. But then you look down the valley, what do you notice in the middle? A church. What do you notice about the church? The lights are off. Why? Because the church is dead. Moses saw this coming 3,000 years ago. He says there are commandments and statutes and truths we must follow. But these truths must be in our heart. And these commandments are the way we love God and the way we love other people. But then he goes on more specifically in verse 7. Moses says, repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. In other words, talk about God when? Always. In fact, I think the principle you will learn from this is to make God a part of the rhythm of life in your home. Make God a natural part of the rhythm of life in your home. See, why is this so important? Because our culture wants us to compartmentalize our faith. Our culture says your faith is fine if you go to a Christian university. Your faith is fine if you go to Sunday school. Your faith is fine in the confinement of your home. But your faith should not influence how you think about culture, shouldn't influence how you vote, how you think about politics, foreign policy, etc. Our faith in our secular culture is to be compartmentalized into a certain section of our life, but not influencing everything. Why does that matter? Because Abraham Kuyper, the great philosopher and politician, said, there is not a square inch of creation out of which God does not cry out, it's mine. And yet, without even realizing it, I think we compartmentalize our faith in certain ways. So let me give you an example. I teach at Biola University. I teach at Biola. I don't think there's a school that does a better job than Biola, teaching a biblical worldview as a whole. I think they do a fantastic job. But I remember something we would do. When I was a student at Biola, we would have a chapel every year. It was the end of the year, and they would have people, so there's like 3,000 students filling up the gym. They would have students who were going on mission trips stand up and they would commission them. So I mean students going to really faraway places like China, India, Latin America, Texas. They'd have students stand, they'd pray for them, they'd sit down, there'd be worship, there'd be the message, and chapel was done. I always remember thinking, why are we only having the students going on a, quote, spiritual mission trip stand? What about the students going to be interns at Google for the summer? Isn't that a mission field? Right? But we don't think about it, do we? Oh, we have our spiritual activities, and then we have the rest of our lives. What Moses is saying, he's saying, no, make God a natural part of the rhythm of life, that God influences how we think about everything. Now, I came across a fascinating study that I think really hit this home. It was called Souls in Transition from Christian Smith, who's at the University of Notre Dame. And they studied students in high school, followed them all the way into the university, asking this question: why are students leaving their faith, and what factors must be in place for a student to have a faith for their whole life, to maintain the faith of their parents, of their tradition? And they pointed something out that might seem obvious, but it struck me as very significant. And you can see it up there. They said the way we develop religious beliefs is the same as in other areas. In other words, there's not a special way that we develop religious beliefs that is different from how we develop other beliefs. So take, for example, you have a family, and we all know that kids who grow up in a certain political family will tend to adopt the political beliefs of their parents. It's not determined, but they'll tend to. So if you have a family on the right, conservative, they'll tend to have kids who are conservative. Family on the left, their kids will tend to be on the left. Now, why is that the case? Well, maybe in the conservative family, in the background they have on Fox News. Maybe in the liberal family, in the background they have on MSNBC News, if you can call that news. Now, what's the point? I doubt either liberal or conservative parents sit their kids down and say, all right, look, we're liberals. Here's what this means. Here's what we view about taxes. Here's what we think about the role of government. Here's what we think about the marriage issue. Here's what we think about social issues. Do parents sit down and formally tell their kids these things? No. Well, how do kids pick it up? Well, you're driving in the car, and what happens? You turn the radio on, politics are on, and mom and dad talk about it. You sit down at the dinner table, you talk about it. You're sitting around at home, and you talk about it. You see, things that are important to us tend to get brought up throughout the rhythm of life, and a young person just learns how to think about those things. So think about something that's important to you. Maybe you like to golf. All right? Maybe golfing is important to you. Do you have a rule in your family that says, we talk about golf Saturday mornings and Tuesday nights? Does anyone have that family rule? If you love the golf, when do you talk about it? All the time, right? Or whatever it is. If there's something you love, it's a natural part of the rhythm of life. You're sitting at the dinner table, you're telling your kids because you're going to go golfing. You're driving them somewhere, you're telling your kids because you're going to go golfing. Right? You're sitting down, you're going to a movie 5 minutes before it starts, you lean over and you tell them that you bought a new pair of clubs. Right? We just talk about it because it's something that we love. Well, here's the question. When do you talk about God? Because if you talk about God with the young people in your life on Sunday morning and Wednesday night, without even realizing it, guess what message we are giving to kids? God belongs Sunday morning at church, Wednesday night at Bible study, but God is not a natural part of everything that we do. You see why Moses says this? He's saying, don't compartmentalize our faith. Make our faith a part of everything we do. Make it a part of the rhythm of life. And then he actually gives specifics how to do this. He says, talk about them when you sit in your house. In other words, talk about them over the family meal. Do you know studies show, this is an article from Newsweek from a few years ago called The Magic of the Family Meal. And they said the studies are clear. Kids who regularly dine with the folks are less likely to be involved in risky behavior, far more likely to succeed in life. Why? They said, here's what happens. They said it's at the dinner table with a shared meal where stories are told, where jokes are shared, and the wider world is seen through the lens of the family's values. They said in this article, even on nights when the food is fast and the talk is cheap, anyways, you meant what I knew. Even on nights when you're rushed at the family meal, you know what they said? They said it instills in a young person a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, and the message that it's not all about you. It's about the bigger group. And how important is that in our culture that says as long as it feels good, as long as you want to, it's okay. There's something about the family meal. Now, earlier on in my marriage, I had the busiest year of my life. I had my first full-time teaching job. I was taking classes at night. We were moving to a new home, and my wife just gave birth to our boy. So this is 9 years ago. My life was crazy. So at dinner time, I thought, man, just to know what's going on in the world, I got to have the TV on. As we're sitting down, after a little bit of time, I thought, what am I doing? I'm setting a trend in my family, that it's okay to be busy and not to focus on each other and let these messages intervene. I'm not creating this special, sacred space to just be together as a family. So now when we sit down for dinner, the TV is off. Unless the Red Sox are playing, right? You don't want to get legalistic, right? But the point is, let me ask you this. Insofar as you can, do you carve out time to share a meal with a kid, to share a meal with a young person? Turn the TV off, turn the cell phone off, and just be together. That's where worldviews are passed. I don't sit down and have a devotional every single family meal. I don't. Maybe once or twice a week, I'll pull the Bible out. We're going through this book called The Story, which tells the Bible as a grand story, and we just kind of talk about it as a family. I want it to feel natural and as a part of the rhythm of life. Then it says talk about them when you walk along the road. In other words, talk about them when you travel. My MO when I travel is either I want to drive to get us there immediately, or I want my wife to drive so I can check my emails. But I started to realize, man, there's something about just travel time. I can talk to my kids, get to know my kids, relate them. So I thought, what can I do to have conversations? So I came up with this game called the question game. And we'll ask our kids math questions, I'll ask them history questions, and I'll ask them Bible questions. Why all three? Because I want my kids to know that there's truth in math, there's truth in history, and there is truth when it comes to faith. These are all real things that we're discussing and looking at together. Now, when I started, all the Christian Bible questions I asked my daughter, she was 3, the answer had to be Jesus. Right? So I'd say, Shauna, who died on the cross? Daddy, I know, Jesus. I said, Shauna, who was born of a virgin? Daddy, I know, Jesus. I thought I'd mix it up. I said, Shauna, where do we go when we die? My 3-year-old looked at me, she said, jail. I think she might be Catholic. Just so you know, my Catholic friends actually think that's hilarious. So don't get offended in case they're like, that's funny. I could see why a 3-year-old would see it that way, right? But there's something about just having this conversation and talking in which a kid's value system is built. And then it says, when you lie down. When you lie down. Man, there's something sacred about the end of a day where a young person's heart is just receptive. A kid's heart, a grandkid's heart, where they're open. So I used to put my kids down because I wanted to hang with my wife. I wanted to go to bed. I wanted to do something. And I thought, man, I'm missing an opportunity. So I'll read with my kids, pray with my kids, connect with them. But one thing I started saying to my kids all the time is I'll say, Shauna, Scotty, do you know you can ask your daddy anything? You know, you can ask me anything. Because I meet a lot of skeptics. You know what they'll say? They'll say, I grew up in church and I had questions. And people gave me simplistic answers. Or I didn't feel free to ask my questions. And I eventually realized I didn't believe. If there's any belief system that values questions, it's Christianity. Because above all else, we're committed to truth. If it's not truth, we shouldn't follow it. So I say this to my kids, and my son, I think he was 7. He goes, okay, Dad, who was Jesus praying to in the garden? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, Jesus is God, right? I said, yes. He said, well, the Father's God, right? I said, yes. He said, well, then was Jesus praying to himself? I said, go ask your mom. I had a mom come in. I was at school a couple years ago, and this mom of a 2nd grader came running up to me. She goes, Mr. McDowell, help me. My daughter asked a question. She's in 2nd grade. I don't know what to do. I said, well, what's the question? She said, my daughter came up to me and said, did God love Osama bin Laden? And I said, oh, that's easy. Whew. Well, she leaned in. She said, well, what do I say? I said, here's what you say. What do you think? I'm dead serious. A question is almost always better than an answer. Why? Then you get to learn what kids are thinking and why. Then you get to have a conversation. Then you build a relationship, and you help that person discover truth. instead of just give a quick answer. Jesus asked over 300 questions, 300 recorded questions, and he already knew the answer. Why? Because he was eliciting a response from people, and he was building a relationship. Then he says in the last one, he says, when you get up, talk about God when you get up. The past few years, I didn't have class on Wednesday morning until about 10:30 or 11, so I'd get up early and I would go to a coffee shop and have like 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted work. And one week I was there, I looked over and I saw a grandfather with his grandson who was maybe 16 years old. The Bible was open, he was reading the story of the Good Samaritan. Came back the next Wednesday morning, grandfather, grandson, Bible was open. I heard him talking about like money and finances and investing. Come back the next week, grandfather, grandson, Bible's open. He's sitting there talking about relationships. And it hit me, I thought, oh my goodness, this grandfather is taking his grandson out every Wednesday morning and mentoring him. He's spending $5 on a muffin and coffee, actually it was Starbucks, $8 on a muffin and coffee, and just teaching life and pouring into his grandson. I sat there and I thought, man, I wonder how different my classroom would be if every kid I taught had a grandfather like that. I wonder how different my church would be. I wonder how different my city would be. You know, my state of California, we wouldn't be in debt if every grandfather poured into his grandson like that. I was so moved by this that I sent out a tweet. I'm on Twitter and it just copies to my Facebook page, and then people can comment in. And I don't remember the words, but something like, watch this grandfather week after week pour his life into his grandson and just teach him biblical truth. And then the comments started flowing in. You know what the number one comment was? I wish I had a grandfather like that. Friends, I've worked with students for a decade, and I can tell you the heart of a young person is to be called the beloved by an adult that cares. One of the biggest lies that I hear from parents, I've heard pastors say it, is kids need their space, they need to figure stuff out. When they need us, they'll come to us. That's a lie from the pit of hell. Young people today have more pressures and more temptations just one click away on the way to the bus stop than you and I had on Friday night when we were out looking for it. Right? They desperately need adults to step into their life. And they might fight it, they might resist it, but the heart of a young person is to have their grandfather, their grandma, their father, a mentor, a coach, a teacher say, you matter to me, and I'm going to help you be everything that God has designed you to be. That's the legacy that Moses was talking about. And I don't know about you, but when I get to the end of my life and look back, I think that's when I'm going to matter most. So the question is, what young person can you uniquely pour into? What young person, even if it's one, can you help become everything that God has designed that young person to be? If you do that, that is impact and that is legacy that will echo for generations. Amen? God, I thank you for the chance to be here. Thank you that we could look at your word and just explore your truth about passing on the next generation. God, myself included, just equip us, challenge us, open up our eyes, and motivate us as we think about impacting the next generation. God, just give us the ability to do this in an age where there's so many challenges that kids are faced. And we pray this in your name. Amen.